So hi, everybody, and it's great to see everyone. I'm Ajahn Sujato, and I haven't been seen the folks from the Buddhist Fellowship for a couple of years now, so I'm really happy to see you again. And of course, we have all been separated by the tyranny of distance and pandemic, and brought together by the magic of Zoom. So at least we have Zoom. And may I ask, before we begin, if it's possible to put your camera on, then I really appreciate that, because currently I'm giving a talk to a bunch of black squares and a few screenshots. So if you can turn your, Shizwan, thank you so much. If you can turn your cameras on, and then I can see some human beings, then that's good. Then I can tell who's falling asleep. I can tell who's watching from the toilet. No, if you're on the toilet, don't just leave it off. That's good. But no, thank you for turning your cameras on. I do appreciate it, because we do a lot of these things now, right? And it's nice to be able to see the other folks who are here with us. All right. So for today and for the next few weeks, I'm going to be teaching about a Pali text called the Ațțhakavagga. And I'm going to be looking mostly at the Pali text and the translation of this, which I did a couple of months ago. But I will also be sort of glancing a little bit at the Chinese and Sanskrit and other versions, which I will mention briefly today, but I'm not going to be sort of focusing too much on that. And my main purpose is that this particular group of texts, group of suttas, is a very central and interesting group of texts that has been important for the Buddhist tradition for a long time. And it contains a lot of things that are kind of, well, we can have a look at it and we can see to what extent it's the same or different from what we might normally find in the suttas. All right, so let me just begin by giving some brief introduction and background. So what I'll do is I'll talk mostly for the first part of the session, then maybe we can do some meditation, just a short meditation. And then if you have any questions, then you can submit those, and the hosts can field or sort those questions out for me. All right, and we can maybe answer some of them a bit later on. But also we have a few sessions, so we should get a chance to answer your questions. Okay, so, oh, and look, before we go on, just may I say, look, I know that we've all been through, we're all still going through this really hard time with the pandemic and everything. And I just hope that you're all well. And I know that, many of you will have family or people that you know who you've lost or who've been afflicted. And it's been a tough time for all of us. So, yeah, so please take care of each other. And as Dhamma practitioners, I think we have a special role to play in this kind of time, because to have a path and have a sense of meaning to our lives that we can find by looking inside ourselves, then this gives us a strength and a possibility that can help us through these kinds of times, and can not only help us, but can also give us the strength and resilience to be able to help those around us as well. So let us begin with just a little bit of background, okay? Now, we've got a fairly large audience here, and I'm sure people come from different levels of background knowledge and understanding of suttas, so forgive me if I am just beginning with things that are too basic, but also please forgive me if I assume knowledge that you don't have, and speak too quickly or something like that. Please just pop in a question if there's anything you don't understand, and I'll try to clarify it, because I can't guess what's going on in your mind. All right. Oh, and I should, before I begin, also acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Baramadical people of the Darug Nation. And I'm coming to you from a place called Harris Park, a little monastery here we call the monastery at the end of the world. And Harris Park is just next to Parramatta, which is named after the Barramadigal people. And they were the indigenous landholders and custodians of this land for many thousands of years. And so I pay homage to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and give thanks for their care and custodianship of this place. All right. So let me give a little bit of an introduction. So we know the Buddha lived roughly 2,500 years ago. We know that he lived in northern India, and we know that he taught the Dhamma for a long period, traditionally 45 years of his life. And during that time, he gave many different teachings to many people on many occasions. And we also know that the Buddhist traditions have collected those teachings into the canons as we know it today. And in the Pali tradition, which is my main background, we have the Pali Tripitaka, and we also have other collections that were translated into Chinese, into Tibetan, and we also have various fragments of Buddhist scriptures in mostly Sanskrit and allied languages, as well as a few other ancient Indic languages. And so this whole collection of texts is very large and not easy to get to understand and to get a hold of, because obviously each of these ancient languages is difficult in itself. The subject matter of the text is difficult, and there's so much material. So there's a lot of sort of groundwork that needs to be done to bring a lot of these things to light. And so this is one of the jobs that I do as part of SuttaCentral, is that I try to coordinate and bring out especially the shared elements in these texts, and to partly I work as a translator to try to translate things into as simple English as I can. And it's not always that simple, but it's not a matter of like dumbing things down, right? But of not being more complicated than necessary, so you try to be as reliable as you can, but then express that without more complication than necessary. And there are, of course, many other people who are also working with in other areas. So, for example, with SuttaCentral now, we have a scholar called Charles Patton who's translating Chinese texts. And he's now translated more than 250,000 words from the ancient Chinese text, which is a lot. And so we're starting to get to a position where people from different backgrounds can read these suttas and can understand what the Buddha was teaching. Now, one of the things that was a great impetus to me in doing this work was seeing that the coming together of the different traditions showed us a glimpse into what the Buddha was really doing. And especially my understanding of this, my understanding of the idea of early Buddhism was informed by my time, especially when I was staying in Malaysia, where I began to have more contact with the Chinese Buddhist traditions and to understand that they're drawing upon ideas and doctrines and texts which are the same that I had known in the Pali Theravada tradition. Now, of course, that's not to say that everything in all these traditions is always the same, and we can't reduce them to say that they're always identical, because each of these traditions has its own historical trajectory, and each has evolved and responded to the Dhamma in their own way. And so, of course, we can find differences between the different traditions. But often we find that the differences that we notice, maybe like different colored robes or, certain different kinds of lifestyles and so on and so forth, different like chanting and so on. We often find that these things are kind of on the surface, and that when the more we dig deeper, we find that there is very much in common in terms of the core beliefs and teachings and doctrines. Now, that common core is not just it's not just kind of vague doctrine. So, I mean, you can express that and say, well, all Buddhist teachings teach about letting go, all Buddhist teachings teach about compassion, all Buddhist teachers teach about wisdom. And so we can say, yes, there are these vague and general things which we have in common, but there are also a lot of very specifics in terms of the actual texts that we share. One of those things which is specific is this text that we're talking about now, the Ațțhakavagga. And the Ațțhakavagga is best known in its Pali version, and that's the version I'm going to be reading from, and that's probably the most reliable and accurate source for information about what the original text was. But there is also a translation of that, an ancient translation of that text into Chinese, where it's known as the Arthapada Sutra, or sometimes the Arthavargya Sutra. The link to that has been shared in the chat, so you can download the PDF, and that that was translated by an Indian scholar called Bapat, assisted by various Chinese scholars in the mid 20th century. And he's done a nice job of translating that text, as well as giving an introduction and so on. In addition to those full translations of this text, there are various other, quite a lot actually, of other references, scattered allusions in the Vinaya. There's a nice passage in the Vinaya where the monk called Sona comes to visit the Buddha, and the Buddha receives him and has him staying in his hut. They share a hut together. And can you imagine what that would be like, to be sharing a hut with the Buddha? You'd be pretty kind of, you'd be, I don't know, I'd be kind of nervous. Where do I put my shoes? What's the right thing to do? And you get even more nervous because the Buddha then says, oh, why don't you recite some Dhamma for me? Right? Can you imagine? Yeah, oh, the Buddha's just like casually, oh, why don't you just, you entertain me by reciting some sutras? And that would be, okay. And so what Sona did at the time was recite the verses of the Ațțhakavagga. And so that was already at that time considered to be that really kind of central text. And it's referred to a number of different Vinayas, a number of different sort of later texts and collections, like say Yogacarya's Bodhisattva Bhumi quotes from, or has a Sanskrit version of one of those texts. In the Tibetan Vinaya, there's a reference to it. In some Gandhari little manuscripts and fragments, we find some quotes and scraps from it. So there's probably a dozen, maybe 24 different references to this text across the ancient Buddhist world. So this tells us that it was present. It tells us that it was popular. It tells us that it was regarded as authoritative, and it tells us that it was highly regarded across all the different Buddhist traditions. So for these reasons, as well as some others, the Ațțhakavagga has often been regarded as one of the earliest and most authentic of the Buddhist scriptures. And I just want to discuss that briefly now before going to talk about the text. And the reason I want to discuss that is because I think that that argument is there's something to that argument, but on the other hand, I think it's also sometimes a little bit overblown. I think it's a little bit overhyped. Yes, it's true that the Ațțhakavagga is quite distinctive in terms of its themes and its form, and in some ways its language and the way that it approaches ideas. And when I was translating it, I was quite frequently struck by like a particular word or a particular idiom, which might recur in a number of suttas in the Ațțhakavagga that you don't quite find in the same way elsewhere in the suttas, or at least not so commonly. It might be found occasionally elsewhere in the suttas. And so there is that kind of that distinctness to it. It has its own flavor, which I think is really interesting. But of course, having its own flavor doesn't mean that it's necessarily teaching a different doctrine than what you find in the suttas. And, on the whole, the doctrines and the teachings are quite similar to what you find in the suttas, maybe a slightly different emphasis, slightly different perspective in some cases. But of course, you find that within the prose suttas themselves. You find so many different suttas with many different emphases. And the tradition has always said that this is because the Buddha was teaching to different people at different times with different inclinations and different needs, and that he was meeting the needs of those people at that time. And there's no doubt that that's true. So within these scriptures that we call our canon and which hark back to the Buddha, we do find that there are some kind of layers, some earlier, some later, and so on. And definitely we want to put the Ațțhakavagga in the earlier strata of that. There's no doubt about that. But whether that means that it's sort of significantly older than, say, most of the prose suttas we find in the Nikayas, I don't really think so. I think that that these things need to be seen together, and that we'll only understand them by looking at them as different expressions of a common Dhamma, which was taught by the Buddha. All right, so this is a little bit of a background, historical background to the Ațțhakavagga, and about how it is common throughout all the schools, and a little bit about the historical situation with the Ațțhakavagga. I'll briefly just describe the formal situation. Ațțhakavagga is one chapter. The word vagga means chapter. Usually it's a chapter of 10 suttas. In this case, it's 16. And it's one of the chapters in the Sutta Nipata. The Sutta Nipata is one of the books in the Khuddaka Nikaya. The Khuddaka Nikaya is one of the books in the Sutta Pitaka. We will come back to this again later, and I'll show you how to do this on SuttaCentral. But that's the main thing you need to know, that the Ațțhakavagga is one chapter of the Sutta Nipata. And as such, it is a relatively cohesive group of suttas, right? They're not like all identical, and they're not like sort of necessarily connected. Right? Like you don't find like the same people necessarily recurring, or the same events in all of them. They're not like tightly bound, but they are thematically and linguistically somewhat a cohesive group, and they were treated as such from the earliest times. The Ațțhakavagga has an ancient commentary, which we call the Nidesa, which is found in the Pali Canon, and so that we'll refer to it from time to time. And the Nidesa often gives us the oldest interpretation of the problematic bits, of which I should say there are many. And I really enjoyed translating the Ațțhakavagga, perhaps more than any other part of the Pali Canon, because it was really hard. And there were lots of gnarly things, and lots of things where you'd look at it and stare at it for the whole day and not be able to figure it out. And that's fun, right? Because solving problems is fun. And there's been a lot of good, great scholarship on this text before. K.R. Norman did a very detailed analysis of it. Bhikkhu Bodhi done more recent translation. Jaya Wickrama, the great Sri Lankan scholar, did an not exhaustive, but an extensive analysis of the text. And there's a lot of other good scholarship that's been done on it. So I was able to stand on the shoulders of giants and hopefully not mess up their work too much, and meanwhile perhaps make a couple of small contributions to the understanding of the text. My main aim with the translations is to make it readable, and to bring out the meaning of the text, as well as to translate it in a way that's coherent with my other translations of the four Nikayas. And so then that puts a particular set of constraints on how I'm doing the translation. But I did feel like I did feel this sense of joy and almost kind of excitement when I was translating. I was kind of looking forward to the next verse or the next thing, because there's always something kind of interesting in it. And I do feel that despite the great job that many of the previous scholars did, that in a number of cases, the senses of the verses was not really apparent in the translation. Not necessarily that the translations were wrong, but that they were maybe, I don't know, maybe not quite capturing the sense of the verse, or perhaps overly literal or something. So I do feel that there's something which is an addition that I've made through my translation. All right, so I should get on to the text, shouldn't it? Because now I'm just rabbiting. I could do this for hours. I probably will. But anyway, let us begin. I'm going to do a bit of screen sharing. Okay, is that all right? And we are all, I'm just sort of looking at the different screens now and seeing who's here. Okay, nice to see you all. So what I might do is that okay, Eileen, if I do some screen sharing?
Sure, Bhante.
Yeah. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the, okay, I'll just mention, I should actually, before I do that, I'll just mention the name. We call the Ațțhakavagga. And the Sanskrit name is the Ațțhakavagga or Ațțhakavagga Sutrani or something like that. There's a few different variations. And there are two underlying possible meanings here. The word artha in Sanskrit means meaning. So this would mean something like the verses on the meaning or the verses on the benefit or the verses on the good or something like that. Whereas in the Pali, the meaning artha can either mean meaning or it can mean 8. And the first, leaving aside the first sutta, the next 4 suttas all have 8 verses, and the 8 is in the title. And Bapat points out that calling something after the 8s is actually a standard literary trope in Indian literature. And there are many texts in the Vedic literature and so on which are named after a group of 8 things. And so clearly it seems that that's the original sense of it, was that the collection of verses with the 8s. And it was improperly Sanskritized to the Ațțhakavagga. Perhaps those who Sanskritized it weren't familiar with that concept of that literary idea of naming things after the groups of 8. Anyway, so yes, so this is why sometimes you'll see different translations. Actually, within the Sanskrit, there are a number of different forms, and also within the Chinese, also a number of different translations. So it sometimes is referred to by different names. All right, so let me see if I can screen share. All right, so let's begin with the first one, the Guhatthaka Sutta. Okay, oh, actually, no, I said I would, I'll give a brief introduction to SuttaCentral before we get there. Let's go home. Hey, we are at SuttaCentral. So here's SuttaCentral. This is where you find the suttas. Some people said, why you call it SuttaCentral? It sounds like a train station. And I said, it's because it was named after the central train station in Sydney. So, so if we want to go to the suttas, we go here, basket of discourses, then the different collections of suttas we find here. So here we're looking in the minor discourses and the minor collection, Khuddaka Nikaya, and down here we find the Sutta Nipata. And here are the different chapters, 5 chapters in Sutta Nipata. We want the chapter of the 8s. So that's how you get there if you want to go stepwise. You can also find suttas a bunch of other ways if you want to. For example, the sutta that we're looking for now is SNP 4.2. See how it has this number there? That's a handy way of looking things up, the 8 on the cave. So I can go SNP 4.2. Hopefully this will work. And I will search. It might not work because I'm using a local version here. It's not properly installed. Oh, there we go. It does work. So for SNP 4.2, and there we have the sutta with a few different translations. And we also have, we can read it in a few other languages, Afrikaans, German, French, Norwegian, any Norwegians out there? And we also have the parallels. So what we have on SuttaCentral, we have what we call parallels, which means essentially that there's a verse or a sutta or a passage which is found somewhere else, and we call that a parallel. Sometimes that somewhere else is somewhere else in the Pali. So here's the sutta here, and here's a passage in the Pali canon where it's also found. And another passage in the Pali canon where that's also found. But this is a kind of parallel. You see how there's a quote mark here? And if you hover above that, it says it's a mention. One text is quoted or mentioned in another. So what that means is that these verses are quoted or mentioned or talked about in these other passages. And these are the passages that I was talking about before that are found in the Vinaya. Here's another one. This one is called a full translation. And that's what we find here. Okay, and that's in Chinese. And then various others, these ones are again mentions. This is the commentary in the Nidesa. Okay, so this is how the parallels work. And so this is how you can find the different versions of the same text on SuttaCentral. But for now, we're going to be looking at my translation, which, as you can see, it says there in English and Pali. And what we can do here is we can show the text side by side. Not sure that which is going to be the best way of doing it. That's good. So we can show the text side by side, and we can view it in a few different ways if we want. We can show it line by line, the Pali and the original text. We can show it side by side, and we can do a few different things like that. We can also turn on a Pali lookup. So if we want to be able to read the meaning of the Pali word, we can then click on there. So the second word is a cave, and then we get the meaning of the Pali word there. So these are some of the things that we can do with SuttaCentral. All right. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read through this is the second sutta in the chapter. Historically, it probably was the first for various reasons, but anyway, at the moment it is the second sutta, and it's called the Guhatthaka Sutta, 8 on the cave. And I'll read through the sutta and then give some discussion on it. Trapped in a cave, thickly overspread, sunk in delusion they stay. A person like this is far from seclusion, for sensual pleasures in the world are not easy to give up. The chains of desire, the bonds of life's pleasures are hard to escape, for one cannot free another. Looking to the past or the future, they pray for these pleasures or former ones. Greedy, fixated, infatuated by sensual pleasures, they're incorrigible, habitually immoral. When led to suffering, they lament, what will become of us when we pass away from here? Kingsu bhavisama ito chutase. What will become of us when we pass away from here? That's why a person should train in this life. Should you know that anything in the world is wrong, don't act wrongly on account of that. For the wise say, this life is short. I see the world's population floundering, given to craving for future lives. Base men wail in the jaws of death, not rid of craving for life after life. See them flounder over belongings like fish in puddles of a dried up stream. Seeing this, live unselfishly, forming no attachment to future lives. Rid of desire for both ends, having completely understood contact, free of greed, doing nothing for which they blame themselves, the wise don't cling to the seen and the heard. Having understood perception and crossed the flood, the sage, not clinging to possessions, with dart plucked out, living diligently, does not long for this world or the next. Okay, so this is the Guhatthaka Sutta, and hopefully I think like some of the qualities that I love in the Ațțhakavagga that we can already see in this sutta, how powerful and direct that the teaching is, how unapologetic it is. The Buddha is not taking any prisoners, and there are some very powerful and memorable words and phrases in here. And there are some things where you look at that and you think, yeah, that's right, that's really true. And there are other things you look at and you think, oh, that's right, that's really true. And it has a way of striking you because of that directness and that aliveness that it has. And sometimes, you know, when we encounter Buddhism, we encounter the Dhamma, you know, sometimes we can find like Dhamma teachings are like sort of maybe sort of watered down or made more pleasant, or sometimes that they are, I don't know, more formalized. They're more kind of like textbook Dhamma and this kind of thing. And it loses that vibrancy and that urgency. And so through these verses, you know, this is why I think these verses are so magnetic, because they are so urgent. And, you know, some of those lines are so powerful, right? What will become of us when we pass away from here? Hina nara machu mukhe lapanti, base men wail in the jaws of death. I mean, that's men floundering like fish in puddles of a dried up stream. But the Buddha, of course, with all of these things, I mean, he's giving us some challenging teachings and ideas, but he's also showing us a way out. And this is also essential to the Buddha's teachings. Many years ago, I saw a book of one of these quotation books, and it had like the greatest sayings of mankind, something like this. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll see if there's one from the Buddha there. And it said the greatest saying, yes, it had quotes from the Buddha. This is suffering, and this is the origin of suffering. Like, that's it. Only the first two noble truths. So somewhere an editor had felt that like 4 noble truths is too long, right? We're just going to cut it down to 2. And unfortunately, that's kind of important, like those last 2 noble truths kind of need to be in there as well, right? So the Buddha is not, the Buddha is not about being like pessimistic or anything like that, but he's about recognizing the reality of the life and the struggles that we're in, and about showing us a realistic response to it. And so this is what we're seeing here. Generally speaking, the suttas in this collection, it seems, were given for monastics. They were given, it seems, in the context of like again, one of the things which is distinctive about this set of suttas as a whole is that they're very embedded in an ascetic culture, which is even like wider than that of Buddhism. And we'll see that come out more explicitly later on. But this is something which is quite common within the early Buddhist texts as a whole, that we frequently find the early Buddhist texts are engaging with people from different religions, different paths, different beliefs. And the Buddha is constantly having discussions with Brahmins, with different wanderers or ascetics, with lay people, having discussions with skeptics, and all of these kinds of different variations of people. And of course, the Buddha would vary in his responses to that. He was not the kind of person who would sort of blithely dismiss everything that everyone is doing and say, oh, what they're all doing is wrong and bad, nor is he the kind of person who would be just a naive universalist and say, oh, all religions are the same. But he would be somebody who would appreciate what is good about different religions and different paths, and who would be not afraid to criticize what is bad about them. And so this is one of the meanings, or what we call vibhajyavada, is Buddha was an analyst, that he would take things and look at them critically rather than accepting them fully or rejecting them. And we see that spirit throughout the Ațțhakavagga as well, that the people that he was talking to were engaging in that world of the different ascetics who were hearing different teachings and different ideas, and challenged in different ways, maybe tempted to practice in different paths, or looking for the appeal of different kinds of ways of living and so on. And especially the very act of debating. And one of the characteristic teachings of the Ațțhakavagga is that the Buddha is pretty down on just arguing about the Dhamma pointlessly. And this is, I think, we'll come to this more later on, but this is a really good caution in our age of social media, where it can be very tempting to spend your life arguing about who's got the right interpretation of Buddhism on the internet. An activity which you may be shocked to learn doesn't usually lead to peace of mind or wisdom. But anyway. All right, so I'm going to look at the text in a little bit more detail. Trapped in a cave, thickly overspread. So here we have the metaphor of the body as a cave. And so the Buddha is, this is the characteristic of these suttas where it's very direct, it's very straightforward, and the Buddha isn't having to explain everything. Right? Trapped in a cave, thickly overspread. He assumes that the person who is listening would get the illusion that he's talking about the body as a cave. Whereas in the suttas, you'll find the Buddha will usually, in the prose suttas, the Buddha will usually explain what the metaphor is, and here he assumes. So it's quite, to me, it's quite like it feels, these texts always feel like they're people who know each other who are talking, you know? It's not like the Buddhists, in the suttas, it's often the Buddha's like addressing like a large body of monks and nuns or something like that. It's more of a general teaching. These seem a bit more intimate, a bit more personal. Anyway, trapped in a cave, thickly overspread, sunk in delusion they stay. The term I've translated as thickly overspread is one of the examples where the Chinese reading is perhaps preferable to the Pali reading, or at least Bapat in his translation suggests so. The Pali bahunabhi channo, bahuna meaning a lot, many, abhi channa is to be literally to be covered over. And you might use it for something like the roofing on a house or something like that. So it might be, here it sounds like it's kind of a emphasizing that metaphor of the cave, like there may be like they're trapped in the cave and it's like overspread and covered. There's like a tangle of vines or something like that that's helping to trap them in the cave. It's kind of what it sounds like. But the Chinese version says that they have many desires. And that harks back to a Sanskrit original, which would be Bahunabhi Chando, instead of Channo, Chando, with a D there. And in fact, there is a Pali reading that does actually have that D in it. So it's not just an invention of the Chinese translator, but there actually is an original Indic text that has that reading. So that would mean trapped in a cave with many desires, sunk in delusion they stay. And so that translation, that's possible. It's one of those ones where you look at it and you think, yeah, maybe that's a more straightforward translation. But also sometimes in trying to decide these different readings, we use a principle called the difficult reading should take priority. And the reason for that is because ancient editors would sometimes, if they found a text that they found to be difficult or incomprehensible, they might correct it to be more normal. And so if you have a reading that's harder and a reading that's easier, then the easier reading is more likely to have been corrected by an ancient editor than the other way around. But it's a very general principle. So it's a bit hard to say. This is why I've kept the Pali reading, because I think it's a more difficult reading. But yeah, it maybe could be the case that the Chinese reading is correct. A person like this is far from seclusion, dure viveka hatitavidos, for sensual pleasures in the world are not easy to give up. You know? So partly this is talking about being attached to the body and being sort of caught, being someone who might be meditating, might be staying in the forest and staying in a hut, and they are still trapped because they're still caught in their own cave. It's interesting that this is it relates to Plato's cave similarly also. But also I think that it's also kind of playing on the idea that the cave is one of the classical sites for meditation. So, from long before the Buddha, it was a common thing in ancient India that the hermits and the sages would retreat to the Himalayas or to the hills of Rajagaha and to find a cave and to meditate there. And that's where they would find freedom from the distractions and the delights of the sensual world outside. And so the Buddha is in a way kind of playing with that idea, turning it upside down and talking about the cave of the body as being a trap. All right, the next one, the chains of desire, the bonds of life's pleasures. So one just terminology to note here, we have the word bhava, which is frequently used throughout this set of verses and others. And bhava, some of you may remember, is one of the links in dependent origination, sometimes translated as existence, sometimes translated as being, sometimes translated incorrectly, in my view, as becoming, but also has meaning of life. in the sense of past lives and future lives. And so I've sort of translated it in sort of a few different ways in different contexts. But here, what it means is being attached to the pleasure of being alive and to being born in one realm or another. So these kinds of chains are hard to escape, for one cannot free another. Nahi anyamokha. So those of us who are hoping for a savior to come and fix all our problems might be a bit disappointed, unfortunately. And the Buddha himself claims that he couldn't fix everybody. So I'm just showing some notes here. And I'm going to be playing around with this a little bit because we're actually just enabling notes on SuttaCentral. So the functionality doesn't work 100%. So, but I'm just kind of checking these. Chains are hard to escape. Fine. All right, yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm just checking the notes that I wrote when I translated because often I will forget these things. Okay. All right, so returning to it. Looking to the past or the future, they pray for these pleasures or former ones. And the word that I have here for pray is the word japa, which you can see here, japa. And I look up, can't recognize japa. Just curious. Okay, so japa is a kind of interesting word because it contains, it's not a very common word in the suttas, but it is much more common in later India, where in the Sanskrit form is jalpa. And so jalpa is often used of like sort of muttering like a mantra. So you might like have your beads, and so you're going through your beads and like muttering the verses and muttering the mantras as you're doing that. So it has that kind of sense of like incanting or praying and so on. But it has, as well as have the meaning of just reciting, it also has the meaning of like longing or wanting something or hoping for something to have. And of course, both of those meanings are found in the English word to pray, because to pray is to say the ancient sacred words, but it's also, our Father, give us our daily bread. It's also to wish for something and to hope for something. And so the word pray actually captures the word japa quite well. Looking to the past and future, they pray for these pleasures or former ones. Right? So this again is this description. Right? So many people are caught in this thing where we are not in the present, but instead we reminisce about all the good things that have happened in the past. We imagine all the good things that might happen in the future. Sometimes this changes as we get older, right? When you're young, it's mostly about all the good things that will happen. When you get old, it's more about all the good things that used to happen. And but you're never really present. And if you live your life that way, you're always living your life somewhere else. You always can just think about that for a moment. Think about what that means if your entire life is spent for something in the future or for something in the past. Then you're never actually living. You're never alive, because the only thing we can say about our life is that our life is always in the present. That's all there ever is. The only thing that's ever real is the present, and yet so much of our life is spent longing for the past or the future. And we forget, actually, this is the only thing that really matters. To take care of the present, and the past and the future will look after themselves. Okay. Greedy, fixated, infatuated by sensual pleasures, they are incorrigible, habitually immoral. Visame nivittha. When led to suffering, they lament, dukkhupanita paridevayanti, kingsu bhavisama itochitase. What will become of us when we pass away from here? And so this is what happens when we are short-sighted and we forget what matters in life. And, I mean, it's like when we think about that today, we think about how easy it is to get distracted, how easy it is to get caught up in life's pleasures. And one thing that the Buddha would always say is that the pleasures of life are in fact pleasures. And the Buddha was not opposed to pleasure in and of itself. He wasn't saying you shouldn't enjoy a good meal, or you shouldn't enjoy laughing and spending time with your family, or you shouldn't enjoy the good things of the world. Actually, pleasure is a good thing. And experiencing pleasure is inherently a good thing. But the problem is that we get caught up in it and we become attached to it. And then that starts to curdle and it starts to become extreme and it starts to go sour. And at its extreme points, it becomes like addiction and depravity, and you lose contact with your humanity, and you lose your compassion, your empathy for others, and you forget what really matters. And so the point about these kinds of teaching is not to say that we can't enjoy ourselves and we can't have a good life or a happy life, but it's saying that's all it is. That's all it is. And this is a pleasure. It will come, you will enjoy it for a while, and then it will stop. That's all. And if you're caught up in that too much, what people do is that they use it to hide this sense. People have this sense that there's something wrong, that their life has gone down a path. See, people don't start out like this. Right? People aren't naturally like greedy or attached or addicted or anything like that. These things are conditions. They happen because of our behaviors and because we reinforce these behaviors in different kinds of ways. And so inside you, there's something that knows this is not the path. And then at the end of days, when time's up, what will become of us when we pass away from here? And that again is caused by the fact that it happens when we are living always in the past and the future. If we're always living in the present and take care of the present, then we're not going to worry. The time of our death comes and we will be peaceful and we'll be happy. And it's not going to be a worry. And this is not just, to me, this is not just it's not just something that happens in some ancient text, I've been around in Buddhism for long enough that I've seen lots of people pass away. I've been to lots of funerals and I've visited lots of hospitals, and I've seen people who've passed away so many times. And most recent example is our beloved elder bhikkhuni, Ajahn, who recently passed away, and the funeral was held yesterday and the service was held today. And at the funeral service yesterday, it was said that her last words, Ajahn last words, were to take care of Seri. And Seri was the nun who's been looking after her for all of these years. And that was her concern when she was passing away, not fear about what's going to happen to her, not worry about what's going to be in the next life, but making sure to look after the people who've taken care of her with such love. And that is the difference when your life is well lived. And it's not just an idea, it's not just a theory, it's a reality, and it happens for many people. I've seen so many people who've lived good lives in the Dhamma, and when they come to pass away, they are happy and they're content. Of course, there's always some sadness there, right? But it's okay. Anyway, that's why a person should train in this life. Siketa, right here, idheva. Right? So there's this idiom in Pali, idha, and in this case, idheva, which literally means here. And it's just one of those kind of little idioms that sort of peppers in the Pali texts, but often has that sense of in this very life, idheva jantu, train in this life. right? As opposed to what he's talking about in previous lives of making prayers for what's going to happen in the future. All right. So I'm not going to ask who here has ever gone down to the temple and lit some incense and shaken the little sticks and sort of thrown them out and make a wish about what's going to happen. I'm not going to ask about that, okay? Because that's your business, all right? And you can go check and make a wish for the next life or whatever. Okay, none of my business, but that's not what the Buddha was talking about. The Buddha was talking about living in this life. Idheva, siketa idheva. Should you know that anything in the world is wrong, don't act wrongly on account of that. Visamang chareya, for the wise say this life is short. So the word I've translated as wrong here is visama. Again, a kind of interesting kind of idiom. Visama, sama is even. Visama is uneven, rough. So anything which is like that rough path, that distorted path. And again, these things which I think are so fundamental to Buddhism and so fundamental to the Buddha's approach that it's easy to overlook them. Right? The Buddha is talking here, Yankinchi Janya, what you know to be wrong. Don't do wrong on account of that. What you know, Janya, not what I tell you is wrong. Don't do that. Right? Not what you read in the suttas says is wrong. Don't do that. No, that's not what the Buddha is saying. The Buddha is saying what you know to be wrong. And this is what the Buddha is always coming back to, that we have to know for ourselves. As it said earlier, nahi anyamokha, one cannot free another. You cannot be freed by another. You have to know. So we have our teachers and we have our scriptures and we have our dhamma and we have our spiritual friends and all of those things who are there to support us and to help us. But at the end of the day, we have to make a choice. And that choice is going to lead us in one direction or another. So if you know that it's wrong, another way. Okay, so Pasami loke paripandamanam. I see this world's population floundering, given to craving for future lives. Oh my goodness. Pajamimang danhagatang bhavesu. Danhagatang, caught up in craving, addicted to craving for future lives. Base men wail in the jaws of death. Actually, I love that line. You may have guessed, but actually taken, I think K.R. Norman translated it that way. I think that's I'm not responsible for that particular line. But it's a very literal translation. Hina nara matu moke labanti. Not rid of craving for life after life. Now, okay. So I'm getting some random yellow lines on my screen from Doris. So I will take them as a decoration. Thank you, Doris, for decorating the text for us. I'm not quite sure where they're coming from, but thank you anyway. Rid of desire for both ends. And again, this is another one of those phrases that requires a little bit of interpretation, and there are some different readings of this. There's a sutta here, Anguttara Nikaya number 6.61, where this question of what the two ends is discussed. And in fact, that sutta is quoting from our passage here and then asking a group of monks, like, what does this mean? And then they talk about and they give that, and then the Buddha gives his interpretation. And so the two ends are the two ends of contact. So that the sensual stimulation, internal and external contact. Pasang parinyaya ananugidho, so fully understanding contact. Doing nothing for which they'd blame themselves, the wise don't cling to the seen and the heard. So what that means when it's talking about rid of desire for both ends or both extremes of contact, it's talking about the way that we have our sense experience. We experience the world inside here but the world is also an experience of something outside. And so that experience is structured around that duality of both in here and out there. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why that experience is necessarily unstable, because it depends on getting all the things you want. And so you can see this is what happens. Like when you see this a lot among, say, rich people, that if you become you can become very kind of selfish and very demanding. You might go to a restaurant, and if the food is not exactly to your liking, it's a bit too cold or a bit too salty or something, people can get very angry. Because, if you're just used to having all of your wants indulged, then you can think, well, I should get everything exactly as I want all the time. And so you can, this subtly leads to a sort of a corruption in the heart and to a loss of perspective about what really matters. So, if we think about those extremes of the inner and the outer, right, the extreme of the internal sense impression and the external sense impression, then both of those things can go to a sense of extreme, trying to control the world outside, trying to have only those things that you're only going to like and never those things you're not going to like. But that's that external one is pretty obvious. But what does it mean to have that extreme, that internal sense of extreme of the contact? Like, how is it possible to be internally caught up in that? Well, one of the ways that we can do that is through, again, a sense of control in terms of our emotions. Like, we can feel that we should never experience anger. It's a common one among Buddhists, that we think that, oh, I'm a Buddhist, I shouldn't get angry. So, okay, sure, yes, we shouldn't get angry, but hello world, here we are. There's plenty of things to get angry about. And the reality is that we do get angry sometimes, unless we're very advanced along our path, and that's okay. But so what we can do sometimes is that we can push that aside. We can pretend that it's not there. And we can preserve, in a sense, our own sense of inner purity. Or another way of doing that is to, for example, ignore the suffering in the world, right? Because I can't deal with that suffering because it will make me feel bad, right? So we're prioritizing our own inner experience of peace over our compassion for others. So these are some ways that I would interpret that sense of the internal thing. Okay, the final verse. And having understood perception and crossed the flood, the sage, not clinging to possessions with dart plucked out, living diligently, does not long for this world or the next. I mean, there's a footnote here, but a lot of these footnotes are just sort of technical notes on the readings and grammatical interpretations. So they're not necessarily very interesting unless you're studying Pali, but they're just there to clarify my understanding of the text. Having understood perception and crossed the flood. So the flood is, of course, the flood of craving and attachment, and this is a common metaphor which we find used multiple times in these texts. The sage or the muni is, again, a very characteristic word used in these texts. Actually, muni is used throughout the early texts, but especially in these ones. And the idea of the sage seems to hark back, the muni seems to hark back to this ancient ideal of an ascetic or a hermit who goes forth and who lives in sort of a mystical way in the mountain and so on. It's a word that has some kind of resonance and feel to it that sort of connects with something old and deep and ancient. The dart is the dart of craving, and we will see the dart reappear again in the Ațțhakavagga. Not clinging to possessions, again an idea that we will see reappearing throughout the Ațțhakavagga. The word opalita has an ambiguity to it, but what it's talking about is the clinging like like the smearing of the water on a lotus petal or a lotus leaf. So just as the water does not cling to or does not smear the lotus leaf, so too one does not get attached to the things of the world. Okay, so does not long for this world or for the next. Okay, so this is the Guhatthaka Sutta, and that's my translation. And I hope that is enjoyable. Let me read the text for you once more. And so what I'll do with these readings is read them through once, read them through, give an explanation, and then read through again. Trapped in a cave, thickly overspread, sunk in delusion they stay. A person like this is far from seclusion, for sensual pleasures in the world are not easy to give up. The chains of desire, the bonds of life's pleasures are hard to escape, for one cannot free another. Looking to the past or the future, they pray for these pleasures or former ones. Greedy, fixated, infatuated by sensual pleasures, they're incorrigible, habitually immoral. When led to suffering, they lament, what will become of us when we pass away from here? That's why a person should train in this life. Should you know that anything in the world is wrong, don't act wrongly on account of that, for the wise say that this life is short. I see the world's population floundering, given to craving for future lives. Base men wail in the jaws of death, not rid of craving for life after life. See them flounder over belongings like fish in puddles of a dried up stream. Seeing this, live unselfishly, forming no attachment to future lives. Rid of desire for both ends, having completely understood contact, free of greed, doing nothing for which they blame themselves. The wise don't cling to the seen and the heard. Having understood perception and crossed the flood, the sage, not clinging to possessions, with dart plucked out, living diligently, does not long for this world or the next. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing now. So I tell you what, why don't we do, I've been talking for a while, why don't we do some meditation? Who wants to do some meditation? Yay. Okay, good. So we'll do maybe like 10 minutes meditation. Would you like a silent meditation or a guided meditation?
Anything, half. 5 minutes guided, 5 minutes silent.
Well, that's guided.
Okay. Some sit silent.
Some say silent?
Someone, yeah, in the chat group.
In the chat group says silent. I'll do a little bit of guidance. How about that? All right. So let's sit comfortably. Bring awareness to the body. Take a couple of deep breaths. And feel that sense of balance and uprightness in your posture. And notice the emotions and feelings that are coursing through you at the moment. Maybe some feelings or reactions from the sutta, from the talk. Maybe something that's been happening to you through the day. And just be aware of that. Notice the gentle feeling of the breath as it comes in and breath as it goes out. And let the breath bring that gentle feeling of peace, joy, washing your worries away. And now coming near the end of the meditation, bring our mind back into the world outside, hear the sounds around. And just reflect for a minute about the process of meditation we've been going through, about the changes that your mind's been going through. And you can come out, open your eyes and come out of meditation. Okay, very good. So, yeah, and may I just say, like, as a general point, like, I really appreciate if people do ask questions, and please don't think that your question is too stupid. If you think that your question is stupid, I've seen worse. Okay, so don't worry about it. And we all have to ask things. Okay, great. Okay, so somebody here's asking me a question. Ajahn Sujato, thank you for the Sutta class. In respect of the sunyata in Chinese is gong, or emptiness by most modern scholars. Previously, it was normally translated as void, null, or nothingness. The pictogram gong means that's gong, right? Yeah, means a workman working inside a grotto to clear the space to make it into a cave. Huh, okay, interesting. Sunyata in the context of the Guhatthaka Sutta. Oh, interesting. I'm not sure. I didn't know about that etymology, but that's fascinating, as the Chinese glyphs so often are. Workmen working inside a grotto to clear the space to make it into a cave. Well, one of the things that points to actually is that emptiness in the suttas, okay, is a conditional emptiness, okay, which is like that. It's a space inside something. So there were these two understandings of emptiness in ancient India. One school of thought had it that emptiness was unconditioned. That sort of emptiness is this kind of like a blank slate, this given world within which things happen. And then the other school of thought is that emptiness is conditioned, and like that is conditioned by the four elements. And so, for example, the space in a house is created by the walls around the house. And the Buddha and the suttas take that stance. So the Buddha treated space as something which is conditioned by the four elements. And that's also, as I understand it, is the situation in modern science. Right? So modern science, if you look at it through the model of, say, the Big Bang, then space is more or less tied up inside everything. It's all sort of compressed into one, and space actually only is created when the universe expands. And so space is conditioned by the expansion of the four elements. That's the same as the Buddha was talking. And it seems that that's the same idea that is being pointed to here. And one of the things that suggests is that, well, there's a certain degree of work which is required, right? Just as the space in your house is acquired by clearing out the rubbish from your house and is cluttered up when you bring lots of rubbish into your house. And so the space in our mind is the same, right? So we create space in our mind by clearing out all the unnecessary things. So yeah, I think that then relates to the idea of the Guhatthaka Sutta, that our mind, our cave, of course the Buddha is saying, we're trapped in our cave, right? Trapped in the cave of the body. Of course, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have bodies, right? It just means that we overburden ourselves with them. We get too concerned with them. And so we can clear out our attachments, and then we have lots of space. Yeah. So thank you for that. I didn't realize that was the case. Good. Have we got another question? So I'll take a few questions, and then maybe we'll see about looking at another sutta. Both ends. Okay, so desire for both ends. So I talked about that a bit in the explanation. Both ends are the ends of contact. Yeah? So internal contact and external contact. And so the desire is really for the pleasure that arises from the sense stimulus, which comes from that twofold aspect of contact. Okay, another one.
Ajahn, do the both ends just mean external and internal contact?
Right, exactly, yes, internal and external contact. Yep.
Whatever the senses may be.
Exactly, yeah. But it's one of those things which is interesting, because when it is discussed in the Anguttara Nikaya, the monks all give their interpretations, and the Buddha says, oh yeah, actually they're all good interpretations, but this is what I meant. And so, it's one of those things where actually you can read it in multiple different ways. So I think that's really important to remember when we're reading the suttas, that there are certain things when the Buddha was talking about that he clearly meant it to mean this and not to mean that. And he's quite definitive about this. But then there are other things where he said, actually, yeah, you can look at it in these different ways. And so that idea of like a creative reading is important to bear that in mind, because we don't learn the Dhamma just by like imposing the Dhamma ideas on us. It has to come something from within us. And so those creative things, those metaphors, they make that spark, that question, oh, what's that about? And it's like you're leaning into it rather than the Dhamma being something which is put on you. You're sort of going out to the Dhamma, oh, what's that? So this is why sometimes the Buddha expressed himself in these ways that would have these ambiguities. All right. Give us another one, Eileen.
The next one is there. Dear Ajahn Sujato, the context of the sutta is basically highlighting the gratification, danger, and the relinquishing of our cravings. May I know if this sutta is more for Sangha or laymen?
Well, I think that this sort of like the, I don't know if I said more for, but it would have been originally given in a monastic context, yes. You can see that from a number of references within the suttas, talking about, for example, living in seclusion. And so that's the kind of typical language the Buddha would use when talking about monastics. So yes, it was originally given to a monastic audience.
Next one is there.
Okay. Not seeing the next one.
Dear Bhante, thank you for your teaching. Bhante, the verse crossing the flood, is that the flood of the Asava?
Sure. The flood of Asava, the flood of Dukkha, the flood of Samsara. And, again, a very kind of poignant thing. Again, it's a very sort of geographically specific metaphor, because in the Ganges Valley, where the Buddha was teaching, the snow would melt on the Himalayas and it would come down in torrents. Many of you may have been to Bodh Gaya, and you'll know that Bodh Gaya on the Narrandera River, and at certain times of years, it's just dry. And then when the rains come, then it's a big full river. And this was like a part of the experience of people living in those times. So flood was a very dangerous thing, and something that really had to be reckoned with on a regular basis in that season when the snows were melting. Of course, these days with climate change, then it's more universal experience. We all have to worry about floods. So I don't know if that's good or not, but if you're living in the Pacific Islands, or indeed, for that matter, in Singapore, then flooding is definitely something that we're all going to have to be facing, in not just a metaphorical sense, but in a literal sense as well. And it's one of those things which is so terrifying, because it just eliminates everything. Like if the land is flooded, there's no more land. And if you can't rise above it or find some escape for it, find some way to hold it back, then you're finished. Yeah. Okay, so why don't we go on, keep some more questions for now, and I'll go on to look at another sutta. What do you reckon? Okay.
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 Do you want to finish last few questions?
How many questions do we have?
About 3, I think.
Okay, give me 3. I'll try to answer them quickly. Go on.
I sent one. How does understanding contact helps to get rid of greed?
It helps to get rid of greed because what we're doing is we're analyzing the way that greed works. the fact that we are that greed helps to tie together these things that are inherently unstable. So if you understand that this pleasure that I'm getting is from something that is outside of myself, that I cannot control and which will disappear, then you can help to moderate your own desires. Okay, next one. So I'd like to read the Chinese and English translations side by side. It seems you can't see the parallel translations side by side. No, we can't. On SuttaCentral, you can only see translations in one language at a time. You can't see a Chinese translation and an English translation at the same time, unfortunately. So that's a limitation of our system at the current time. Maybe at some point we could add that functionality, but not at the moment. Sorry about that. So you just have to load that up in different windows and look at it side by side windows to read that.
So only Pali and English?
Only Pali and English, yeah. And we're rolling out like Chinese and English translations and like various other languages like Pali and German and so on, but not like multiple translation languages side by side. But it is something that I've thought about, and maybe at one point we will add that functionality. It's certainly possible in theory, but we just haven't done it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so someone's asking that essential pleasures are not inherently bad in themselves. That's true. And like, I think that's really important to remember that. Like in Buddhism, like the words we use for good and bad, the most characteristically Buddhist words for good and bad are kusala and akusala. Now, there's many words for good and bad, punya and papa. We saw another one like sama and visama. We saw in the sutta today. So there's many words to express what's good and bad, but kusala and akusala are the most like, they feel the most Buddhist. They're the most, they're quite specific. And what kusala and akusala mean literally is skillful and unskillful. And this is why that when I've translated them, I've actually translated them literally in this case, even though, you could normally translate them as wholesome and unwholesome or just as good and bad. And that's certainly correct translations. But there's something specific about that idea that what is good is something which is skillful, that what is bad is something that is unskillful. And the idea that sort of good and evil have some kind of inherent existence is not really the way that the Buddha looked at it. The thing the Buddha was really concerned with was suffering. And he didn't want people to suffer. He wanted them to be happy. But what he said was that we seek happiness in unskillful ways. So when we act out of greed, hatred, and delusion, it's not that those things are just nature. Greed, hate, and delusion are just nature, like a flood, like a cave, like a fire. They're just natural. There's nothing good or bad about them, actually. But they lead to suffering. Right? So this is why they're unskillful, why they're akusala. But pleasures themselves are good, but the problem is how we seek them. And it's interesting if you look at how the Buddha talked about a layperson's life. He said one of the things that laypersons should do is to earn money in order to make themselves and their families happy, and to not do that. He didn't want people living like Scrooge McDuck or like Citizen Kane or something like that, where you're just got all of this money and you can't ever be happy because you're just you're too caught up in it. This is wrong. We should use our money to find happiness for yourself and happiness for the people around you, but not to an extreme, just to moderation. Okay, next one.
Someone would like to know, does internal contact refer to thoughts? No,
internal contact, is the sense bases, internal and external. So the internal sense base is the ear and the external sense base is the sound. So it's the contact, the sound and the ear. And so you see both of these have like a physical reality to them. And so the idea of contact is the idea that they hit each other. It's called patiga sampasa, is the resistance contact or impact contact. Right? So there's actually a physical hitting of each other, which is caused when you have this physical contact. And that, of course, is also stressful. Right? That's why when you're in meditation and you hear a sound, even like a small sound, it can be quite annoying. All right, let's go on to the next sutta. Otherwise, we'll run out of time to do that. We're not going to get through all of the suttas in the Atthakavagga in this course, but we'll try to do at least a few of them. Okay, let's go. Next one. Let's look at so I'm going through the first. So this is like the second, third, fourth, and fifth suttas, which I think are the original core. These are the eights, and this is what the Atthakavagga is named after. And this is the Dutthatthaka, sometimes translated as the eight on corruption. The word duttha technically can mean either malice from the Pali dosa, but dosa can mean either Sanskrit dosha or Sanskrit dvesha. And dosha meaning corruption, dvesha meaning hatred. So sometimes you'll find this translated as the eight on corruption. However, for various contextual reasons, it seems to me quite certain that it means malice. Anyway, let me read the sutta. Some speak with malicious intent, while others speak set on truth. When disputes come up, a sage does not get involved, which is why they've no barrenness at all. The word I've translated barrenness perhaps be better translated as hard-heartedness. How can you transcend your own view when you're led by preference, dogmatic in belief? Inventing your own undertakings, you'd speak according to your notion. Some, unasked, tell others of their own precepts and vows. They have an ignoble nature, say the experts, since they speak about themselves of their own accord. A mendicant, peaceful, quenched, never boasts, thus am I, of their precepts. They have a noble nature, say the experts, not proud of anything in the world. For one who formulates and creates teachings and promotes them despite their defects, if they see an advantage for themselves, they become dependent on that, relying on an unstable peace. Kuppa praticca santi. It's not easy to get over dogmatic views adopted after judging among the teachings. That's why, among all these dogmas, a person rejects one teaching and takes up another. The cleansed one has no formulated view in the world about all the different realms. Having given up illusion and conceit, by what path would they go? They're not involved. For one who is involved gets embroiled in disputes about teachings. But how to dispute with the uninvolved? About what? For picking up and putting down is not what they do. They have shaken off all views in this very life. This is the Dutthatthaka Sutta, and we can see that it has many of those qualities that we saw with the Guhatthaka Sutta. It has that quality of like directness, that quality of almost like a kind of personal and intimate flavor to it. We can see that it has it's speaking to something which is like kind of very central and very important in the spiritual life and spiritual practice. However, we can also see a shift in theme, that rather than talking about focusing on the body and our attachment to the body and the pleasures of the body, we're now talking about views and attachment to views. And this is one of the very characteristic teachings that we find throughout the Atthakavagga. Of course, the question of views and our attachment to views is discussed many times in the four Nikayas and the Prose Suttas as well. This particular theme is one of the themes that people have argued is characteristic of the Atthakavagga, that the Atthakavagga essentially says no view, whereas the suttas, the Prose Suttas say right view, okay? So the Prose Suttas say, this is the right view, this is the right way to see about the world, and those are wrong ways of seeing about the world. So there's a kind of dualistic approach, whereas the Atthakavagga has more of a non-dualistic approach. It says, don't see the world through any views. Yeah, this is the argument that some people make. I don't entirely agree with it, but at the same time, it's not entirely wrong. Clearly there is this sense of avoiding these extremes of attachment to views. But let's look at what the text actually says. One of the problems with the reading and the interpretation of it, as I alluded to in the introduction is that I think that some of the ways that some of these terms are being translated is not necessarily incorrect, but it doesn't bring the meaning through as clearly in the translation as I believe it is in the Pali. Anyway, so the first verse is setting out the basic idea. So a sage does not get involved when there's arguments, and that's why they've no barrenness at all. So the word barrenness, kilo, is again, it's a technical term, and what it means is that they don't have any sense of being hard-hearted or angry, specifically regarding like their companions and their colleagues. Like, I mean, you can apply it more generally, obviously, but when it's used in the suttas, what it means is that you're not angry at your fellows in the spiritual life and the people around you and these kinds of things. So this is an example where there is a word which is used quite casually here in the Dutthatthaka Sutta. It doesn't feel like it needs to explain it. It assumes that you know what kila means, and yet it only really makes sense when understood in terms of the prose suttas. And so this is one of the reasons why, you know, I'm not fond of this idea that the sort of the Ațțhakavagga is necessarily earlier than the prose text. I think that they're related. Okay. How do you transcend your own view? So this is one of the themes of this particular sutta, one's own view, one's sakka ditti, right? So rather than having like an understanding which is learned from a teacher, or an understanding which is even born of experience or something like that, we're talking about views that are invented through theorizing and opinions. When you're led by preference, dogmatic in belief, chandanunito, rutiya niwitto. These are specific terms that are used in very characteristic ways throughout the Ațțhakavagga. As my note says there, the other translators render chanda in this case as desire, which it may be correct, but the Nidesa here has the idea of chanda as a view. So chanda here I think means preference. And the word nivitta has a literal meaning of concluded or established, something like that. But it's used in the prose suttas, but especially in the Ațțhakavagga in this very specific technical sense, meaning a dogmatic attachment to view. Right? So rutiya is your basically your dogmatic attachment to your beliefs. Rutiya niwitto. Inventing your own undertakings. This one's a really kind of hard one to translate exactly, but what it's talking about really is basically, you know, an undertaking or samadaya. I mean, a samadaya is what we do when we take precepts, for example. Right? We samadha the precepts. And so what it's referring here to is when different ascetics or teachers or practitioners will invent their own thing. So I might say, oh, well, I'm going to invent my own set of vows. I'm going to invent my own set of practices. I'm going to decide that if I do this, this, and this, then I'm going to get enlightened. And of course, we see this very commonly today, and there is a very creative proliferation of different kinds of spiritual practices, spiritual paths, spiritual ideas. You can go on YouTube, you can follow various people who are enlightened, and all of these kinds of great stuff. But again, it's all speaking according to people's limited understanding of things. And it's another interesting usage here. The word janeya or janati means to know. It's used constantly throughout the suttas, one of the most common words in the Pali Canon. Yet here in the Ațțhakavagga, it's used in this rather distinctive and specific way, where it's actually like normally jnana is unapologetically a good thing. Right? You have knowledge about something, great, that's good. Whereas here, it's saying you speak according to your jnana. And so clearly it doesn't mean you speak according to your true insight into the nature of reality. Right? It clearly has a different kind of sense. So it means according to your limited ideas, according to what you think is true. So this particular sense of janati I've translated as notion again here, which I think brings out the word a little bit more clearly. Okay, so I'm unasked, tell others of their own precepts and vows. right? Again, see above all the arahants on YouTube or whatever who are going out and boasting about all of the things that they've done or whatever. And then anyway, whatever. But some people apparently find that kind of thing impressive. They have an ignoble nature, say the experts. Obviously, the Buddha didn't find it impressive since they speak about themselves of their own accord. And also notice here, I mentioned before about kusala and akusala, kusala meaning skilled, akusala unskilled, and normally just meaning good and bad. But here, again, a characteristic usage, we find the word kusala is used in a personal sense as in the people who are skilled, i.e. the experts, and I've translated here. So there you get like a sense for what is the sort of the root meaning of the word. A mendicant, peaceful and quenched. So when in my translations, I translate bhikkhu as mendicant. Normally translated as monk, or just Bhikkhu Bodhi just leaves it as bhikkhu, but I feel that is better to translate it. Mendicant is the actual root meaning of the word. It means somebody who wanders for alms and who seeks alms in the bowl, and that's what the word bhikkhu means. It means someone who's seeking alms. And I wanted to translate that for a few reasons. One reason being that, well, it's just a literal translation, but also because that sense of a bhikkhu as a mendicant it's kind of lost a lot in our current world. And yes, there are some Buddhist countries and Buddhist cultures where going for alms is still a normal practice. And when I was in Thailand, I was brought up there, we'd go for alms every day. And some places where it's still kind of possible, some people do it. When I was in Malaysia, then I would go for alms, and when I was in Ipoh, I would go for alms pretty much every day. And so it's still a living practice, but for much of the Buddhist world, it is not. And sometimes for understandable reasons, like if you're in Tibet, you're living at the top of a mountain, then no, I'm not going to be climbing down to the bottom of the mountain every day to get a bowl of rice, right? I mean, there are obviously physical reasons why these things are changed sometimes. Here in Sydney, at the Lokanta Vihara, we are very blessed to be living in Harris Park, which is just near what we call Little India. And so down the road is all the shops where they sell the samosas and gulab jamun and things like that. So we go for alms round every day, and we're supported by the Buddhist community, from all the different Buddhist communities, but also from the local Indian community. The Sikhs, the Muslims give us food every day, the Hindus and so on. We met with one of our friends one time, Venerable Akaliko and myself, and he was just a guy from Sydney, and he saw all these people giving us alms, and he was puzzled. He said, "But aren't they the competition? I mean, they're like Hindus and Muslims and things. They're the competition. Why are they helping you?" And we're like, we don't really think of it like that, They're just people helping out and being kind. And so to us, it's a great blessing to be part of that ancient culture and to be participating in that. I mean, to me, it's such a beautiful thing. It's one of the things I love most about being a monk. Okay. For one who formulates and creates teachings, again, this idea of creating your own religion in a way, your own philosophy, pakapita sankata, right? When the Buddha talked about different kinds of ascetics, he talked about some ascetics who taught a teaching based on their tradition, some based on some sacred scripture, some based on what a teacher said, some based on their experience through meditation, and others based on theorizing, right? Based on thinking about things and coming up with ideas about things. And that's what he's talking about here. So it's talking about somebody who's inventing a teaching based purely on their thinking about things. So this is the this is that, and this verse is exposing one of the problems of this. So you can have an idea that seems to you like a good idea, and look, maybe it is. It's not that it's necessarily a wrong idea, but because you haven't actually seen and realized it, then you become attached to that idea, you become attached to that teaching, you become attached to the idea that you are the one who's teaching, that you've got a community, that people respect you, and all of those things. And so that creeps in as this gradual kind of corruption that sort of sneaks up your lizard brain, and it turns everything sour. And even though your initial intention might have been quite pure, the peacefulness that you get from that is not real. And the happiness you get from that is not real, because it's just based on an idea. And so this is why the Buddha was not a favor of this kind of things. It's not easy to get over dogmatic views. Again, the idea of nivesa, it's the same word as nivitta we encountered earlier, adopted after judging among the teachings. Again, a characteristic word in the Ațțhakavagga, the samuggahita, is to adopt something. Nichaya is to judge. So samuggahita is to, literal meaning is to just grasp something or take it up. But in these passages, it specifically means to adopt a particular idea, right? So this is, again, it's like this idea of like shopping for ideas. You know, you go, this teacher's teaching this, that teacher's teaching that. You read this in this book. Oh yeah, that seems right to me. Oh, that's the one for me, right? And so you, but you're not getting over. You're always just attached to one thing or another. You're not letting go, really. You're just picking up one thing and letting go of another thing. And so this is not really the path of letting go. And this is a really important lesson to remember in Buddhism itself. This is not just applying to things outside of Buddhism. It happens all the time in Buddhism as well. People will look at what one Ajahn teaches, what one Bhante teaches, what one monk or one nun teaches. They'll look at what they find in one book or something like this, and they'll say, well, is this one right or is this one right? Oh, that one says this and this one says this. And you're always trying to judge about which one is right and which one is wrong. But you'll never get over your views just by doing that. So it's not saying that, you know, you can't use that reflection and to have that critical understanding of these different views. It's just saying that don't get too attached to them, because it's just an idea. What matters is when you apply that idea and you see what leads to letting go. And when you do that, then you will understand. Because very often, actually, these different ideas are really just from different perspectives. They're not actually necessarily that different, right? And, you know, one teacher might say, oh, to meditate, you have to put in a lot of effort and work really hard. And another one might say to meditate, you have to relax and be really happy. And they're not necessarily teaching different things, but they're actually useful for different people in different ways at different times. So don't get too caught up in trying to figure out exactly what the right teaching is in any particular case. Sometimes, yes, we do, but just keep a moderation about it. And remember that what really matters is the practice. The cleansed one has no formulated view. The dhona, right? He's talking about the arhat, a formulated view in all the world about the different realms. So they're not like imagining where they're going to be born or what these lives are like and these things, having given up illusion and conceit. By what path would they go? Sakena gacheya. They're not involved. Sakena gacheya. I love that line. Yeah, sakena gacheya. By what path would they go? For one who is involved, gets embroiled in disputes about the teachings. But how to dispute with the uninvolved about what? I don't know if you've ever tried to do this, but it's really annoying. You know, if you meet somebody who's very kind of advanced in the path and very wise, and then you can sort of try to sort of catch them out on things and so on, and then they're like, oh, okay. Yeah. And then anyway, this next one also really important and a characteristic phrasing in the Ațțhakavagga, which is often not really brought up, not really brought out in translations. For picking up and putting down is not what they do. Atta niratta nahitasa atti. A more obvious way of translating that would be to say they have nothing that is picked up or put down. Right? So it's in a past sense. There's nothing that's picked up or put down. But what does that mean? I mean, obviously, we've all picked up things, right? We're all attached to things. We've all let go of things. So this is a particular idiom which we find used a number of times in the Ațțhakavagga, and it always should be understood in an active sense. It doesn't mean that you've never picked up that an arahant has never in the past attached to anything, because obviously they have. It's not talking in a past tense. It means that they're not still caught up in the process of picking things up and putting them down. Atta niratta, yeah, that's what it means. And so it doesn't mean that, the niratta doesn't mean that they haven't let go of anything. Obviously, they have let go of things, but it just means that they're not still in that process. They've shaken off all views in this very life. And this is a point in the translation that took me quite some time to figure this out. And as I put in that note, that even the Nidesa, the ancient commentary, translates these words in an active sense. And clearly that's how they have to be understood. Okay, so I will, let me just read through the sutta once more to finish up, and then we'll see if there are any other urgent or important questions that need to be asked. Where are we now? Okay. Some speak with malicious intent, while others speak set on truth. When disputes come up, a sage does not get involved, which is why they have no barrenness at all. How can you transcend your own view when you're led by preference, dogmatic in belief? Inventing your own undertakings, you'd speak according to your notion. Some, unasked, tell others of their own precepts and vows. They have an ignoble nature, say the experts, since they speak about themselves of their own accord. A mendicant, peaceful, quenched, never boasts, thus am I, of their precepts. They have a noble nature, say the experts, not proud of anything in the world. For one who formulates and creates teachings and promotes them despite their defects, if they see an advantage for themselves, they become dependent on that, relying on unstable peace. It's not easy to get over dogmatic views adopted after judging among the teachings. That's why among all these dogmas, a person rejects one teaching and takes up another. The cleansed one has no formulated view at all in the world about the different realms. Having given up illusion and conceit, by what path would they go? They are not involved. For one who is involved gets embroiled in disputes about teachings, but how to dispute with the uninvolved? About what? For picking up and putting down is not what they do. They have shaken off all views in this very life. Okay, very good.
Dear Bhante, this particular sutta reminds me of the Mula Pariyaya Sutta. Could you please comment on the idea of full understanding by not taking delight in anything? Thank you so much, Bhante.
I like how people just like coming up with these like really simple, easy ones for me, but that's good. I think that's great that we have obviously an educated audience here. Excellent. Obviously, all of our time spent teaching at the Buddhist Fellowship for these years hasn't gone completely to waste. Excellent. So yes, so clearly by the end, then yes, it's talking about the same thing as the Mulapariyaya Sutta, right? It's talking about the full understanding is the Arahant, which is clearly the same as the one who's not involved. And yes, you're quite right. The Mulapariyaya Sutta talks about this idea of conceit and the idea of like how one's thought processes tend to like form and create and reinforce our sense of self. And so in that way, it actually is a very kind of, quite related thing. I mean, the Dutthatthaka Sutta is then focuses more on teaching, which is not and talking about it, but which is not a theme that in the Mulapariyaya Sutta as such, but the psychology of it is the same. And, that's actually like a trap for a teacher, especially a spiritual teacher, is that it's very easy to get caught up in your ideas and to believe the things that you're talking about just because your ego gets involved. And so that's why it's really important to keep on questioning these things. So yeah, these are quite closely related texts. Okay, the next one. I wonder where you think conceit is hiding within the 5 aggregates. Oh dear. Would you please provide some guidance on how to abandon conceit in the context of the Dutthatthaka Sutta? Well, there are 2 real questions there. First of all, conceit is hiding in the 5 aggregates. That's not how I would really think about it. The aggregates are a metaphor. Like there's a metaphor which is there. So when we talk about the aggregates, the Buddha would always talk about the Panchupadana Khandha, all right? The Panchupadana Khandha, the 5 grasping aggregates. Now, how do you grasp something? You grasp something with your hand. Yeah, and so that's why there are 5, because it's like 5 fingers. So when you grasp something, you have form, feeling, perception, choices or volitions, and consciousness. Yeah, 5 things. And those 5 things are what grasp. And when you grasp something, it punches you in the face. That's why it hurts. That's why it's a Panchupadana Khandha, because it's a punching. I mean, I joke, but actually the English word punch is actually from that same root, right? And so this is the metaphor. Now that metaphor is a really interesting one. Why? Because you look biologically, you look at your hand. Yeah, our hands are built for grasping, aren't they? Built for holding on. But if you look biologically at it, then you have a set of muscles that hold and another set of muscles that open, right? And the set of muscles that hold are strong, and the set of muscles that open are weak. So what that tells us is that holding on is harder than letting go. See, normally we think letting go is hard, right? But if letting go is hard, we would need big muscles on the back of our hands. Letting go is easy. Holding on is hard. And the only reason we think holding on is easy is because we're used to it, because it's all we've ever known. It's the easy part. Okay, next question, Aling.
Yeah. Dear Ajahn Sujato, may I know, in this case, does the Noble Sangha not give any view in the situation of dispute? Does that mean there is a proper time to do so? Thank you, Ajahn.
Right. Yes. So yes, of course, and and obviously there are disputes, and this is where the advice here has a particular context. Like one of the things you see, like if you look, you may be familiar, like in the Tibetan tradition, where you have like a culture of debate, and there's a whole kind of thing around that where that's part of the training, and that draws on an ancient tradition in India. Now, when that debate is done in the Tibetan context, it's done more in a way that's like an educational form that's meant to sort of test people's understanding of things and ability to articulate it. But in ancient India, it was a bit more like a sort of gladiator's arena, right? I mean, the way that it's talked about, it's kind of, it was serious. They weren't messing around. And, there's many tales of that. For example, one of my favorite stories is the story of the bhikkhuni, Bhadda Kundala Kesa. And in Bhadda's background story, she was formerly an ascetic, and she was a great debater. She would travel across the whole of India, and she would set up a little sapling, a tree or branch in a pile of sand outside the gate of the town, and she would issue a challenge. Any ascetics or philosophers, anyone wants to come and debate me, then come and get it. And she would debate everybody and annihilate them all until everybody would be scared. And whenever she would approach a town, all of the other ascetics would exit because none of them wanted to debate her, and nor did they want to be shamed by trying to debate her and lose. So until, of course, she met the Buddha. So they were serious, right? They weren't messing around. And so this is what the Buddha was talking about, was this kind of combative way of getting in there, that you're getting in there to win, rather than to getting in there to find the truth. And again, this is why the sutta begins with that idea of malice. Like the Dutthatthaka Sutta, it's about, you're going in there because you want to beat the other guy, not because you want to actually find what is true. So finding the resolution to conflict and being able to sort things out is a difficult thing. And it's a thing that requires time and patience and effort. It's not easy. It requires an assumption of good faith and goodwill on both parts. And it cannot proceed when it's just about point scoring, and it's just about trying to justify your own point of view or anything like that. There has to be good faith joining together to look for the truth. And I think, these things I mentioned a bit earlier about social media. Again, don't want to get into that too much, but we do see this almost like this collapse of capacity to have civil discussion and rational disagreement. And this is going in different rates in different countries. I mean, if you look in what's happening in the United States, for example, it seems like it's almost become impossible to have a civil discourse in that nation. Australia is not so bad yet, but we certainly have our struggles. And it shows us how much effort it takes to be able to sustain a culture where it's possible to discuss things in a meaningful and civil way. And that's something that we can't just take for granted. And you can't just sort of go around and just insist on your free speech or something like that and expect that that's going to have any meaning. It's not good enough. Freedom of speech is not good enough. You have to have speech that is meaningful, a speech which is compassionate, speech which is rational, speech which is true. And these things are the right speech that Buddha was talking about, rather than just free speech. Okay, next one.
And maybe we'll take this as the last question.
Okay. Have abandoned views or listen to the power on the mind. Okay, so have abandoned our views. Well, I mean, I don't know if I can.
Ajahn can read it out because you're.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. Yes. How can we abandon our views or lessen their power on our mind? Thank you. So, well, I don't know if I can put it better than the Dutthatthaka Sutta and the other suttas of the Sutta Nipata will put it. But first thing is to become aware that they are in fact views. And this is something that is really helped by meditation, because when you meditate, you see your thoughts forming, you see your intentions forming, and you begin to realize, actually, this is just something that I'm doing. It's not the truth. It's not the reality. It's an idea that I've just had. And you start to see that these things are impermanent and that they're changing. So this is one thing which is really important. Another thing which is really important is just looking at what are the effects and outcomes of these things. The Buddha was a pragmatist in regards to the truth. So again, just to sort of give an example, you might have an argument about what is the best way to cook fried rice, for example. Somebody says, no, you have to do it this way. Somebody says you have to do it that way. Someone says you have to have peanut oil. Somebody says you have to have sunflower oil. Somebody says you have to have oyster sauce. Somebody says you have to have soy sauce. Somebody says you have this way and that way. And someone says, and what is the right way? Well, actually, the proof is in the pudding, right? You have to eat it. You realize actually there's not necessarily one right way. There's many ways of doing it that's going to end up being delicious. It doesn't necessarily matter all that much. It doesn't mean that there aren't some wrong ways, right? There's always some wrong ways, but there might be plenty of right ways. But it's only when you taste it that you actually know. And so this is one of the things with the views. It's not about being right in a technical sense, but it's about whether these things lead to peace. And this is what the Buddha is always coming back to in these verses. That peaceful one who doesn't get involved finds peace. They find quenching, nibbana. And that is the test of when we're able to let go of views. Again, it doesn't mean that we don't have any views, but it means that we're not attached to our views, that we see that they are in fact just views. That's all. All right. Getting a little bit on. We've lost a few people, but not too many.